Good evening, folks, or good morning, depending where you are in the world. My name is Ryan, I'm your host, and this is the channel Overlord Shiny. Today, we're talking about the Kurnothi as a potential new faction and predictions for this weekend. Starting off with the Kurnothi, we recently had a teaser today for a new Kurnothi. I'm going to get tired of that word before this video is over. A new character for Warhammer Quest, a Kurnothian renegade, as it was. And that sort of provoked a thought into me as to what the Kurnothi could potentially be as a faction. And a lot of this has to do with two kits we've seen, one being the Kurnothi from Warhammer Quest, and one being the Kurnothi from Beastgrave. Now, if you haven't seen the Warhammer Underworld kit for Beastgrave, it is our very first introduction to what the Kurnothi potentially were. And it is a sort of, I want to call it a gateway set for what the talking. Okay, so the Kurnothi, as we are presented with them, they look like Age of Sigmar's version of satyrs and centaurs, and they sort of have that mohawk with fire mane, red hair. Harkens back to the world that was. And for those of you who aren't familiar, these are basically the new incarnation of the War Dancers. But for those of you not familiar with the War Dancers, they were one of the coolest things about the Wood Elves back in the day. They had flowing fire red mane hair, depending on how you painted them, of course. And they sort of were like the most unique part of the Wood Elves, in my opinion. And they were cool. They're like almost druidic, Celtic inspirations, in that they had giant swords, and the lore behind it was that they were constantly dancing and flipping around and doing the dance of death, as it was. For those who play 40k, they were basically the Harlequin version of Age of Sigmar, without the whole laughing god bit. They were worshipped Kurnothi at the time, who is now the new version of, who is the old version of, of Kurnothi. Kurnothi being the god that Alariel smote back in Dark Harvest. For those of you who haven't read Dark Harvest, it was sort of a big lore bit, and I feel comfortable talking about it now, considering it's been out for 2 years at this point, 3 years. But yeah, so Kurnothi was murdered by Alariel, and we don't know why. And that leads me to believe that as a new faction, they're not going to be part of the Sylvaneth. Or they might play it up like Alariel did back in the day, where they had the model. For those of you not familiar, I'll have all this up on the screen over there or somewhere. But there was a model called Orion, and he was sort of a character who was summoned into being by the sacrifice of a wood elf prince. And every season he would be summoned, and by the end of the season, or seasons or whatever, he would fade into the earth. He would die, pass away, and then he would be brought back the following, I want to say, spring. He was up in spring and he died in winter, something to that effect. And for the longest time, I just assumed that Orion was the new Kurnothi, but that's not really how the lore went. It was Kurnothi, and Orion and Alariel were sort of the king and queen who worshipped Kurnothi. Well, Kurnothi is dead in the world that was, and the new incarnation is Kurnothi. But how that plays out, we have yet to see. And, well, Age of Sigmar is about gods. And Kurnothi, being a murdered god, he is still a god. I mean, that hasn't stopped the Daughters of Cain at all. Marathi's seen to that. But, yeah, they're a potential new faction. And the exciting bit about the Warhammer Quest character is that this is clearly an elf. It isn't a centaur. It isn't a satyr. it's something brand new. I mean, don't get me wrong, they still have the antler thing going on, right? But I feel like it's a headpiece as opposed to a physical part of her body. And I think a range of these would be fantastic. Now, this is all just hearsay at this point, obviously, but there's a lot of legwork being put into making a faction that's existed all this time. Maybe on the outskirts, maybe just in the wilds, which would be very appropriate for Wood Elves, I might add. Or potential Kurnothi. Kurnothi. I'm going to go with Kurnothi here. But all you need to do is look at the previous edition, the last edition of the Wood Elves, for sort of where they're going to potentially take this. Now, obviously, we have satyrs. They have a melee unit, and they have a unit that has a bow and arrow. I wouldn't be surprised if those were dual kits, actually. We have a centaur unit. And they're not actually called centaurs or satyrs. I'm sure there's going to be an Age of Sigmar version of these words. But for all intents and purposes, it's a centaur. I wouldn't be surprised if that is a dual kit. You know, he has a spear. They probably have like a spear throwing version and a spear stabbing version. Or some effect, maybe even a dual wield version, which I think would be very metal. And of course, the main character is a spellcaster. He has sort of this rod with an antler stag head on it. And you have the Battle Cat. I'm going to go with Battle Cat here. That's several units right there. And once you start adding in actual elves, be they renegades or whatever, that is a very, very good core of an army. I'd argue that's an even better core than what the Lumineth started off with. Once you start adding in special models and like potentially Orion or Kurnoth, you might even get like the Kurnoth Hunters into the action from the Sylvaneth range, depending on how they want to do the lore on that. But yeah, I think that's exciting news. And segueing from Warhammer Quest into this weekend's release, it's all about Warhammer Quest. What are your predictions for this, guys? I personally think that what we are going to see is going to be 90% Warhammer Quest and maybe 10% of future Stormcast stuff, to be honest. Stormcast. I'm not excited about Stormcast myself, guys. I don't want to predict that, but I mean, one of the silhouettes is clearly a Stormcast. The other silhouettes point to another character in Warhammer Quest who also looks to be Sigmarite in nature. In fact, there was and I'll put this up in the pictures somewhere, a picture of, this character with the artwork. And then, of course, we saw a silhouette, which is remarkably similar. We see what looks like a vampire with the lower leg parts. And I think that's going to be a good baseline for the army. How they'll play, nobody knows. If they're anything like the vampire lords the vampire counts, from the age or the world that was, they'll play very similar in that they have a lot of shaft units and a lot of powerful lords. And the shaft units were all about basically pinning characters into place, and through attrition, they would basically hold units there while they died, and they had to resurrect and die and resurrect. That was sort of the vampire lords shtick right there. And while these ghouls or zombies or skeletons were doing their thing, the vampire lords were destroying stuff. And the best part about it is you can customize your vampire lords. If we'll see any of that, that'd be fantastic. As much as I like Age of Sigmar, the ability to customize your characters is fairly low, in my opinion, at least compared to the world that was. And for the vampire lords to get a lot more customization, I think would be a breath of fresh air, so to speak. And we'll see how that plays out. So, for those of you who are curious, the vampire lords their whole thing was that you spent most of your points on your lords, and your lords are the ones who did the work. Everybody else is sort of just there to keep the lord alive. You'd have blender lords back in the days, what they were called. I'm not sure what they're called today, but basically, they were there to duel and destroy enemy characters. You had your spellcasters, and you could customize them to be debuffers or resurrection summoners like necromancers. Um, and then they had, like, of course, the death magic that they were rocking. Really cool faction. It was one of the ones I played, actually. I played them, I played Bretonnians, and I played dwarves. And obviously, Bretonnians aren't a thing anymore unless you count, the flesh eater courts. So those are my predictions. What are your thoughts, guys? I mean, are you excited about the potential Kurnothi, or the Soulblight Gravelords? I love vampire counts. I'm going to, unless I'm radically disappointed, which I don't think I will be based off the models we previewed so far. They had that Van Karstein charm to them that I'm digging so far. But we haven't seen anything yet. Anyway, write your thoughts below. And if you like my content, feel free to subscribe. I'm not at the level where I have a Patreon yet. It's just me for now. But I hope that as I continue to do this, you guys will feel free to donate or whatever. I don't know yet. But for now, those are just my thoughts. Thoughts, opinions, comments, leave them down below. Have a good one, guys.